Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's a good pleasure to join you, just like my colleague from India. It's just a few minutes to 10 p.m. in Lagos, Nigeria, where I'm dialing from. It's such a great pleasure to be part of this event at New Rips. Quite unfortunate I'm unable to physically attend. Now, this session is like going back to the foundation of everything that other speakers have spoken to. How are we talking about data generations? As we know, a lot of the sessions have spoken about models, optimization, evaluation against some of the state of the art, and of course, productization as well. So a lot of my work, what I'll be talking about, will reflect on a lot of effort in Africa, not just in Nigeria, around an intentional effort to build data that can serve for multilingual language modeling. Looking at the effort of Black in AI community, African NLP, Mashakeni, or those are sponsored by global organizations like Mozilla Common Voice, or Lacuna Fund, or AI for Development, which have shown strong commitment to cross-lingual and multilingual model development. And this is extremely very, very important in low-income contexts like Africa, where AI or NLP is becoming more like a bridge to serve a lot of areas where there are infrastructural shortages and challenges. If I look at one of the big products we have today, one of the latest innovations called Intron Speech, which is an attempt to use ASR for health, such that we can use natural language processing to midwife the engagement between patients and doctors in a continent where there are few numbers of doctors. And that's the conversation I want to emphasize on the need for data. So I'll be sharing my screen where I will present my thoughts around this whole concept in the next 20-25 minutes, around the imperatives for building, data set. And the way I've called it highly nuanced and context-aware data generation approaches that is very important and very critical for making meaningful impact in low-income contexts like Africa. And I've called it towards LLM generative diversity. In order for us to attain some level of diversity, there must be an intentional effort to go back to the core, which is the data, before the models and all the evaluations and all the productization. We must emphasize the intentional effort to build data set that truly capture representations of the people, especially in a culture where the owners of the language are not digitally traceable and trackable. So we have to go meet them where they are to be able to find their language and digitize to serve them. Since I've mentioned that, the solutions being built today in Africa are largely inclusion-oriented to address gaps for the low-income segment. So in terms of structure of my presentation, I'm going to talk around 4 key pillars. I'll talk about the urgency of diversity, why data is critical. I will speak on diversity consideration. And then I'll look at some of the key learnings, about 6 papers that I'm going to talk about that have made effort around data generation from low resource and what we're learning from them. And I will close by speaking more specifically about what we are learning at Data Science Nigeria, our nonprofit, and DSNA, our for-profit, what we are learning and what we think should be a standard template or methodology for intentional, inclusive, ethical, compliant, context-aware, extremely nuanced data generation that can serve robust modeling, multilingual modeling for productization and high-impact usage. So I'll start with the urgency of diversity, and I'm going to go to this nice visualization by Felix Lohman, who runs an AI startup based out of London called Neuraspace, which is one of the leading AI startups that is promoting the use of NLP for low-resource language. As you all know, I don't have to define low resource language for all of us. We know that it's less studied, resource is scarce, it's less computerized, less commonly taught, but extremely useful. And if you look at the map, the variations are very obvious. When you look at the NLP solution today for low resource language, we're talking about 6%. And when we talk about Africa, we're not just talking about low resource language, we're talking about extremely low resource language, compared to languages like most of the Indian languages, which are becoming more digitized. But when you look at Africa, they're extremely low resource. So, and you compare that to English and you look at the number of speakers, today we have about 1 billion people in Africa, but yet with diverse languages across countries, over 54 countries, a lot of work needs to be done, particularly because there's a lot of issues around downstream tasks, because applying natural language processing for downstream tasks has direct impact on qualities of lives of people. When you come to area of education, health, financial inclusion, having digital interface that can mediate service delivery, that can solve basic problems, whether health intervention, where resources are limited, are so critical and very important. And this, for me, is the rationale for this new model for building data set. And the whole issue about resourcefulness gap, which is captured by this screen in terms of what are the realities in Nigeria or in Africa in terms of the fact that there's a lot of poverty beyond poverty in cash, to data poverty, talent poverty, skill poverty, information poverty or device poverty or computational poverty. And all of this begins to they're not painting a picture of a continent is disaster, but a continent that needs a new approach, a new methodology, a new way of answering the question of data, even when things are not available. And this is extremely important for global multinationals who are playing in the continent to understand the context and begin to ask questions around how this can be done. And this takes me to the whole questions of data that is being used to build on the continent or build for the continent, where there's a lot of non-representativeness and incompleteness in some of these data. The data are not nuanced. They do not represent the local diversity. They do not represent emerging cultural evolutions of the people. And this is captured in a very popular statement by a popular iconic singer from Africa who said, "Teacher, don't teach me nonsense." So when the model is teaching what is wrong based on the way the data was collected, it's not from the data owners. It's actually for data capturers, those who have captured the data and put it online, not the real owners, not the native speakers of the language who understand the context, the adaptation, people who have the linguistic understanding and who have the mastery of the meanings and the syntactical dynamism of the language, are not involved in the process of development. And one thing that makes it more complex is the fact that low resource language are very complex and nuanced. For example, Yoruba language spoken in Nigeria and in many West African countries, as far as some part of Latin America, Cuba, Brazil, Argentina, spoken by about 60, 70 million people, is tonal based. So most of the text available in public domain today are not well diacritized, so which means that they do not have tones. And if I look at the example shown to you on the screen, there are about 10 words that are presented on the screen. And what makes the difference, even though they are spelled the same way, if I use a typical Latinized English, but because of the tonality and the diacritization that has been applied, both at the top or below, it means different things. And this is what makes it even more complex and demanding and makes it more imperative, the need to focus on data generation. And if I go a little bit further, even with that, there are no one-size-fits-all for low-resource language because they come with a lot of linguistic features. I've spoken about tonality, and this is represented in about 80% of African languages. So it's a big context. And the gameplay is that those tone or the accretization can be lexical or grammatical. And I provided two examples. In Yoruba, it is actually lexical, so it has different meaning. It has different semantic adaptations. So the tones provide semantic enrichment. But when you come to a place like Akan, which is in Ghana, it brings in some grammatical variations, to the use of tonality. So when tonality or diacritics are applied, it changes the entire meaning of the word. So which means that there's no one size fits all. There must be a level of intentionality in how we build the data set to be able to adapt, adjust, and serve these peculiar linguistic variations. So I move to the second part of my speech, which is on diversity consideration. What should we consider when we are looking for diversity as far as low resource language is concerned, particularly those who are building in or building for low resource countries in Africa? The first thing is to understand the fact that there are very limited diversity or the availability of ground truth data for large-scale downstream tasks. Most of the emerging startups in Africa are actually building their data from the scratch. And of course, that lends itself to a longer go-to-market, a lot of learning as you go. And even those who rely on perhaps secondary data means that the model that you have used, from which the data from which the model learned from, will inherit or transpose the biases that are inherent in it, particularly when we rely on the internet. As many of us know, most of the content on the internet are insufficient. They are not representative. Most times that they are even offensive or poor quality because they are not from the native data owners. They're just from those who are privileged to be online, especially in the low resource context. And most of these people who are online are not the natural speakers of the local languages. And then a lot of work that's been done on the continent has been largely dependent on religious texts because those are some of the most digitalized and most structured data set. The most popular being JW300 from Jehovah's Witness, which are largely religious context or Bible context. Those are the most dominant contexts, online news. So the implication is when it comes to coverage, vocabulary coverage, representativeness, you observe that they are limited in range, in topics, and in domain application. And so therefore, they are limited to serve multiple users. So these are very important contexts to note. I've spoken about vocabulary coverage. Now, even though a lot of effort has been done around parallel corporate development, sentence development in Africa, but most of them consist less than 100,000 translated sentences. So we are still very far, when it comes to linguistic quality or contextual meaning, because there are no annotated data to support effective model, or the fact that the models that exist today are trained on very small number of parallel sentences. So which means that there's very poor coverage, out of range vocabularies that cannot be seen, And of course, for those that even exist, we've seen there's a lot of quality issues, ethical, religious biases, cultural, lack of cultural alignment, and all of that, and this will present a true picture of the constraints that exist within African context or low resource context, and the need for us to be more intentional in how we go to build the data. And of course, the costs, the popular cost of multilinguality and the implication of prioritization, while Africa is not a priority, sits well on the cost of multilinguality. As we know, the more languages a multilingual model is trained on, the less it can capture the representation, the unique representation of any specific language. So therefore, language model builders would definitely trade off and default more to regions where data will be able to give them more value, and that leads to a lot of lack of focus on low resource country in investing in data development, because all that they would look for is just looking for easy way out, which is what can we call on the internet and how can we easily use it. But even with that, I have some good news, and that is my third point around some of the things are already being done in Nigeria, in Africa, that are quite instructive, that we can actually build data set from the scratch. And this data set can actually enhance innovation and can address the issue of generative diversity and resourcedness gap, which I've discussed previously. So I'll speak to effort being made by, which is represented in this paper, presented at African NLP workshop at this year's ICLR, which was an attempt to demonstrate some diversity within Hausa language, a language spoken by about 70 to 80 million people in northern Nigeria and some West African countries up to Niger, Libya, up to Ghana as well. And one thing they did very well here, which for me is a major learning, because where I'm going is I'm going to go towards how to achieve generative diversity. So I'm going to pick learnings from all of these and bring all of them together. So one thing that happened here was the fact that whilst other previous data developers have relied on religious context and blogs, they went into social media to be able to pick colloquialisms, the slangs, our language can have different meaning within social context. How they were able to build colloquial expressions such that for every word, what are the colloquial expressions as used on social media, these really helped in enriching the diversity of the data set, in being able to have more representation, in recognizing the peculiar traits in our data set. The other one is Menu 20K, which was built by a group of people in Africa called Mashakani, which for me, it's the first multi-domain parallel corpus of low-resource Yoruba to English language pair. And one thing that makes it very interesting is the fact that, when it was split to some other data set, the religious data set, it improved the translation performance over all domains. And from a benchmark perspective, it outperformed a lot of pre-trained MT model by far, including Opus MT and Facebook M2M 100, because it was intentionally built, to reflect the nuances of the people. While it might be said that it takes time, it's costly, to really make impact in low resource context, there must be an intention. And one thing that makes the data unique was its intentional multi-domain combination. So there was an effort to collect data on critical domain areas, health, finance, science and technology, and built from the scratch. And of course, one other work, which is also from Mashakani of note, is part of speed tagging, to also, these are all representations of effort being made, and the fact that they are bridging the gap and they are demonstrating the fact that indeed, to really have quality data, we must be intentional to build from the scratch and to really make impact. And now I go beyond data to the process of how the data is also developed. There's a need for participatory research community. When we bring people together, there's a lot, that we can achieve. And that is one of the things we are coming to realize in Africa, that it requires a network, it requires a group of people, it requires multi-country combination of different experts to make it happen. And one good example that validates this is the Humans in the Loop Bambara to French translation project that was reported in a paper by Tao in 2020, where a process was defined. And within the process, people were collecting the data, people were translating the data, people were learning from the data, people were validating the data and cleaning the data. And within the entire value chain, there was active learning, what was called human in the loop. So they could annotate errors, they could highlight things that may be culturally invalid or may be culturally inaccurate, and that becomes a new learning in an iterative process. So it becomes a new way of generating data that brings people into the entire process, especially in the low resource where standards have not been set, benchmarks have not been evaluated. We're just trying to learn and build what works and what will work. And of course, we've seen even more structured one. This is not in Africa, this is in Croatia, which is about going beyond just use of people to embedding some level of gamification into it. And this has led to about 4 million segments, about 110 million words that have been translated through a game. How much words can you translate? How much words can you evaluate? How much words can you expand? So issue around creating multiple instances against a sentence. So this sentence, in how many ways can this sentence be written? And it's gamified. So the more you are able to expand it and the more people confirm that what you have done is right, the more you rank on the leaderboard. Now, these are amazing novel approaches, and I think they provide us a lot of learning on how we can indeed generate data in low resource context. Now, I go to the last part of my presentation. In the next 4 minutes, I'll be done. What are we learning in our organization? Now, we're learning the same thing that happened in New Zealand. I'm sure many of us will be familiar what happened in New Zealand very recently, where there was a battle by the indigenous people in New Zealand against Whisper, where they were asking, give back our language. They do not want a situation where model developer, multilingual model developer will just go online and crawl the language without engaging the local data owners. The whole concept of first speaker engagement or cultural ownership. What is the whole construct around this? It means that context awareness is very critical when building data for low resource. Context meaning is king. And like I've said, the meaning of the word can be changed by a tone, and the structure of the language also may change. Of course, in creating training data is beyond just what you can scrape online, how much you can scrape online and just ingest massive volume of data. There's a need for cultural ownership and for speaker engagement. And that for us is what we're learning because we've seen that the real people who use the product that natural language process is meant to bridge are real people who are not online, who do not generate the content online. So it means that they must be involved in the process of building the data. And so therefore, we think the key consideration for low resource intentional and inclusive data are just about 4. We must understand that local language and English can be combined within single sentence, code mixing, code switching. And I'm sure my colleagues in India also know how English and Hindi are also combined. And then there's the issue of sociolect. Sociolect is different from dialect, where words differ because of social group based on where you are. And this is a big issue in emerging market where the society is extremely stratified. There are words that are spoken in more sophisticated household, and then when you compare it to low-income household. And most of the AI solutions being built are being built to solve problems in low-income household. So getting sociolect right becomes very important. And the last part is the ethical embedding. We must embed those ethical issues and value alignment in the way we also evaluate those data, whether we bring humans in the loop or we train our model to also identify words that may be inaccurate. And that takes me to what we are learning in Nigeria, the need for bottom-up data generation, what we call the voice of the data owners, where we begin to bring in real people to generate real data as part of their daily lifestyle. We call it journaling, audio journaling, where real people have a device that they take with them where they're able to reflect on their day. They can record about 30 to 50 minutes or 60 minutes of how their day went. And they use their language to capture their reality. This allows us to be able to pick a lot of dialectal variants. It brings a lot of context, values, and ethics into those conversations. And this brings in a lot of insight. And the other thing you also do in journaling is the fact that you also bring in some of the standard parallel sentence, and you use these people to also interpret it in their own way. So if a word means this, what are the other ways this word can be spoken? So you just give them a device that allows them to report or generate their data for you. And of course, whether there's internet, it works offline, Whenever there's internet, the content can be uploaded. So these are very, very important learning, if indeed we are very keen about generating. Of course, data augmentation is also very important, and that is area where we understand these socioletical variations for which we can bring in some robustness into our model, where a single word can be expanded, where we use people to say this single word in what other ways can it be said, you know, and it's more powerful when it comes from real people. And to be very frank, this can also be digitized, like a neural space augmentation app, which can also generate up to 10 sentences or even generates 40 instances of the same sentence, you know, which gives more variations, more robustness, more representativeness, more inclusion into the ability to extrapolate and find meaning in words. So as I wrap up, of course, validity, this is a very fantastic model example, factuality evaluation framework, which works like a legal cross-examination to recheck using multi-turn interaction to revalidate every word. Because of my time, I'll start wrapping up. So what is it that we're learning? And as I wrap up, this will be my last slide. We propose crowdsourced and bottom-up multi-way and multi-context parallel corpus creation for low-resource language. Why is it multi-way and multi-context? Now, every single sentence, you work with crowdsourced community to also expand it. Multi-way, it is not based only on what is online. You also generate those words from the real speaker, translating the audio to text, you know, and bring humans and people in the loop for necessary level of augmentation and enrichment, as you know, so that you are able to representatively capture different people. So this is what we are learning in the country as a way to really build data set that really work, data set that can support startups, data set that can be productized, especially knowing that in emerging market, it's not just academic work. It's actually to build products that can solve health problem, financial inclusion problem, agricultural problems, and the people we're building for are low-income people that need what works. And that's what we're learning at DSN-AI, where we're building localized data and access infrastructure for generative AI in emerging market. And of course, we won some recent award from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and UNESCO on the ability to prove that homegrown data that speaks to real people, that is built from real people, can indeed solve real problems. So thank you so much for listening. I'll be very glad to take questions and any thoughts and perspective on this inclusive model for data generation. Thank you.